There are a lot of theories as to how Ben from Jurassic Park 3 died, but here's the most plausible one that we've come up with. After Ben and Eric had to cut loose from the boat, the wind carried them away and eventually they got caught in the trees. In the footage that we see of Eric and Ben in their last moments together, we can see that Ben is hanging from the tree only a few feet off the ground. From what it looks like, if Eric were to stand up at that moment after cutting himself loose from Ben, it looks as though his head would reach around Ben's knees or just above them. Ben mentioned that he would then cut himself loose right before Eric decides to turn off the camera. People are probably wondering why Eric would even bother turning off the camera, but being as resourceful as Eric is, he probably at that moment thought that they would eventually need the batteries for something later on, or they would need some form of entertainment while they're on the island. He never got to get the batteries. Anyways, Eric is safe and sound, but Ben is still hanging when the camera is turned off. Billy, Alan, the Kirbys, or the others discover shortly after that Ben never got to cut himself loose. Now to figure out what killed him, we've got to perform a little scrutinization by taking a peek at his skeleton in decomposition state. Normally, a human body when buried 6 feet under the dirt, without being in a coffin or without being embalmed, would take up to 12 years to decompose into a skeleton. When we see Ben's corpse, it is obviously a skeleton with very little meat on it, and slightly higher up in the tree than what is shown in the camera, and his legs seem to be missing. Which one of you watching didn't notice that before? In the footage shown before Eric turns off the camera, we see that Ben has blood on his right leg, which is indicative of injuries he sustained during the fall. Falling down into a tree or through several trees from a very high up point is not a gentle landing, and it's possible that he could have been pierced by a branch or knocked about so much that he could have internal injuries. The adrenaline would have kept him going and talking before he even realized he was hurt. However, something prevented him from cutting himself loose, and this event took place conveniently after the camera was turned off. We'll be setting up the very likely theory as to how his death occurred. Let's revisit the hypothetical scene. The region in which Ben and Eric landed was eerily close to the raptor's nest, so it's very likely that the raptors heard the commotion and came running to defend their territory, which housed the eggs. Eric drops to the ground after he releases himself. Ben Hildebrand fumbles trying to get himself loose. Eric notices that the camera's still on and goes to turn it off, thinking that he could save the batteries, because they might come in handy later. At this point, Eric probably noticed that Ben is hurt. As Eric reaches up, trying to help Ben unentangle himself, as he would need to for falling through the trees had proved to be very rough, they both hear a noise. There's the ever so slight hint of growling and animalistic calls being made from a distance. Eric's heart beats fast in his chest as he tells Ben that something is coming. He tries to work double time to free Ben, but Ben then kicks him away and tells him to hide. Thinking fast, Eric takes the life vest that he had loosened up after he dropped to the ground and tosses it as far away from Ben as he can, hoping that it will be a distraction to whatever is coming while he hides in the bushes, in the complete opposite direction not far from Ben. Also, quite resourcefully, Eric, as he's hiding in part of the underbrush, belly on the ground, rubs some of the dirt and detritus all over his face and body to try and mask his scent. Oh, he wishes he thought to do that for Ben, but there is no time. Ben tries to stay quiet, hoping that he won't draw any more attention to whatever is out there. But to his and Eric's dismay, it's too late. From out of the trees, 2 velociraptors come slinking out to investigate what had just dropped next to their door. One of them sniffs down at Eric's vest, as the other looks directly at Ben. Luckily, they don't see Eric, who's hiding underneath the bushes a few feet behind Ben, and luckily downwind of them, so if there's any trace of human scent on him, they won't be able to pick it up. Eric watches in horror as the raptors close in to Ben, bobbing their heads like birds as they begin to circle the hanging man. Ben starts to hyperventilate, fearing for his life. Eric watches as more velociraptors make their way from out of hiding and start to all surround Ben. The raptors all start to tilt their heads as they look up at Ben, as if marveling at what he is. In a stark panic, Ben does the only thing he can think of. He tries to grab onto the harness and the tethers of the parasail to pull himself higher up into the trees to get away from these things. The brown speckled one that doesn't have quills on its head starts to snap in Ben's direction. The others follow her example. In a very intelligent manner, what looks to be the lead female of the group goes right up to Ben's hanging leg that's kicking like mad to gently place her jaws around it. She puts enough pressure to keep his leg outstretched and still as possible. She then slowly applies more pressure and pulls Ben. Ben screams, and Eric cries softly as he watches the whole thing unfold before him. The other raptors join in and start to rip Ben's legs to shreds from trying to pull him down from the tree. Ben's harness is the only thing that's keeping him hoisted. All the raptors start to close in on his legs to prevent him from climbing up. Ben screams, but he can't feel the pain. The only thing he knows is that he has to climb high enough to get away from these things. Eric can't watch anymore, and he lowers his head face down into the dirt to cry softly as he can. The raptors have not detected his presence yet, and shamefully Eric thinks to himself, I hope they don't. I hope they're distracted enough from killing Ben that they won't ever find me. From sheer willpower, Ben pulls himself up with what seems like the strength of Hercules to get out of the reach of the raptors. And with every pull, he feels himself getting higher and higher up the tree, and it becoming easier to climb up the tethering. He can no longer feel anything tugging on him. The raptors are in a frenzy below him, and some even head back from whence they came. As Ben looks down, he can see the other raptors looking up at him, and some of them jumping to try and get to him. But he did it. He's now high enough, but they can't reach him. He showed them. Then he opens his mouth wide and releases a maniacal, victorious laughter in the faces of the raptors below him. He can't stop laughing, and maybe it's because of the relief that he was actually able to get away with his life. The other raptors stop jumping and turn their attention to something else. Ben feels amazingly tired. He wraps his wrist and his hands around the tethering so that if he has to slouch, he won't fall back down. The attack from these dinosaurs seemed to have lasted for such a long time. It didn't seem so bad, come to think of it. But where was Eric? He must have hid very well. As Ben stared down at the creatures, he marveled at them. The dinosaurs were actually real. But as he inspected them closer, his vision started to fade. But he noticed that they were eating something. As he focused more intently, he realized that they were feeding on what looked to be a human leg. Hopefully it was not Eric. But the leg looked too big to belong to Eric. Were there other humans on this island? Thank God they found that leg and they were no longer interested in him. Ben had the very disoriented feeling that he was slipping out of his harness. This time he reached to tighten the waist part, but he couldn't find it. Those things really tore his legs up, and he wondered in that moment how bad it was. As he felt around for his legs, he couldn't feel them. Maybe the legs were numb, but his hands seemed to just go through air. He brought up his hands and saw blood coating them, and it's then he realized that he could hear constant pouring of liquid beneath him. He looked down to investigate what was happening, and to his horror, realized that both his legs were gone. He looked over at the leg the raptors were consuming and came to the realization that it had been his leg. The other raptors have probably gone off with the other one. Ben was losing blood quickly. That's why he was tired. As soon as all of this hit him, a wave of deliriousness came, and then he just wanted to sleep. He became cold and unable to think clearly. The darkness took over him as he heard the raptors chomping down on his limb. From Eric's vantage point, he could see the life leaving Ben's eyes. The raptors fought over the leg they were eating until one of them won the scrapple and ran off with it. Eric lay there for a very long time, for what felt like several hours, too afraid to move. After it started raining, Eric got up using the noise of the rain as cover and made the decision to head in the complete opposite direction to where the raptors had gone. After Eric gets himself together, he comes back to visit Ben's body and sees the man's corpse covered in green creatures. They stop eating and look directly at Eric, completely flabbergasted by his sudden arrival. Without any warning, they all release themselves from Ben's corpse, drop to the ground, and start after Eric. Eric panics and runs back to his hiding place. Even the little dinosaurs are not safe on this island. The little green dinosaurs known as compies had picked almost all the meat off of Ben. It was rough for Eric to see. Sadly, Eric had come to terms that he was completely on his own. So that's our assessment of what happened to Ben Hildebrand and how this poor man met his death in Jurassic Park 3. In quick summary, he and Eric crash landed, and before Ben could free himself, the velociraptors made their way to the scene as it was right by their nesting site. The raptors attacked Ben as he was hanging from the parasail and took his legs. Then compies fed on his dead body. This movie was released so long ago, but people were still reeling over how this happened. But that's our theory on how Ben met his fate. What's yours? Let us know in the comments. And thanks for watching. This has been Altiori. You ask, we answer.